All right, so today's video is about those first terrifying couple of shifts, especially if you're doing hospital-based nursing, and where you suddenly realize that no one's hanging over your shoulder and you're actually kind of doing this all on your own. So, kind of going to start with a couple handy hints for you. What I would really strongly recommend when you're starting off as a new grad is getting like a little pocket-sized notebook that you can write things in, whether it be phone number, useful tips, where to find policies, whatever it is that you find helpful, but you're not sure if you'll remember it. Write it down. That can be a really great tool for you just for keeping track of things. I would also say get yourself a decent sized water bottle. Style's totally up to you. I personally love a water bottle with a straw in it because I find that way I can still drink even whilst I'm like documenting or typing notes. And that really helps me to make sure that I stay well hydrated. Take your breaks. Seriously, take them. Make sure you take them. It is so much better for your patients if you do actually take your breaks, because being dehydrated and hangry does not improve your nursing care or your critical thinking. Start everything as early as you can. So, as a basic kind of rule of thumb, obviously always check your hospital policies, but drugs that are BD, you can give an hour either side of that time. If a drug is a once a day, you can give it kind of 2 hours either side of that time. I personally always start my regular OBS rounds approximately 1 hour earlier. So, for example, if I have a regular round at 12 p.m., I will start doing that round from 11 o'clock because I cannot do 5 sets of OBS all precisely at 12 o'clock. I highly recommend as well that you do use a time planner as a new grad. You will find a lot of older nurses or more experienced nurses won't use them, and I don't use them for every single shift anymore, but I do still regularly make a time planner. I find the act of putting a planner together helps me to grasp what needs to be done for the day. And when I do my time planner, I like to include not only when meds are due, but if they're IV meds, if they're oral meds, if I have any scheduled meds, if any of those meds are time sensitive, like my Parkinson's meds. This helps me to have a better idea of how much time each task would take. I also like to specify if my patient has any additional OBS, so rather than just writing OBS on my time planner, I will write if they need BSLs, if they need neuro OBS, if they're on an AWS chart, or else I do have a tendency to forget and then I have to go back into the patient's room again. My time planner also, using a time planner kind of also helps you figure out what tasks you can cluster. So say, for example, I've done my time plan and I realize that my patient needs a pre-dinner BSL at 5:30, has a 5 p.m. metformin and a 6 p.m. paracetamol, then I can actually probably cluster all of those tasks at 5:30 rather than going into the room at 5:30 and 6 p.m. The other advantages of having a time planner is when someone asks you if they can do something to help, and hopefully when you're a graduate they will, then you can quickly look at your planner and figure out what task you can delegate. For example, in my second week as a grad, one of my patients had to be stroke called, and I had to escort them to CT right in the middle of my AM med and drug round. And I was able to give my planner to another team member so they knew where I was up to and what still needed to be done for my patients. I also really strongly recommend going back and rechecking all your meds charts after the doctors have done their rounds because they may have added or ceased medications. You will find yourself as a grad dealing with a lot of emotions. These might include things like fear, anxiety, stress, feeling inadequate, feeling helpless, being exhausted, and feeling constantly pressured. I spent my first couple of weeks mentally freaking out about the fact that I was an independent nurse now and no one was checking all of my work, particularly like medications. It felt so weird giving drugs without someone else there checking them. These are all quite normal emotions to feel and experience as a beginner practitioner, but try not to become overwhelmed by these, sorry, or to think that somehow you are a failure because you're feeling these emotions. It's really important to remember you are a graduate. No one expects you to be performing like an RN who has years of experience under their belt. It is completely okay if you're not as fast as another nurse, or if you don't know as much as another nurse. Don't place unfair comparisons or expectations on yourself. You are working as part of a team. Nothing relies completely and totally on you. Work out who are your resource people, who can you go to for help. This might be your clinical nurse specialist, it might be your ward educators, it might be a clinical nurse, it might be one of your RN peers, depending on what the question is, it might be your ward clerks. They generally know where everything is. So ask questions and remember that you're still learning and that you are going to continue learning for the rest of your career. And honestly, it is going to get better. You are not going to feel like this forever. It is a temporary thing. You will also need to, as part of being a new grad and as part of your career, accept that you are going to make mistakes. It is inevitable and everyone does it. Senior RNs with years of experience can still miss things or misinterpret things. Obviously, don't aim to make mistakes. Make sure that you're following your policies and procedures, and if you don't know where they are, look them up. Don't be afraid to say no if you feel a task is not within your scope or to seek clarification or help. The first time I went to insert a nasogastric tube, I read the policy and I went and got my clinical educator to come and supervise me because I'd never done it before. The fact that I also had 2 med students and an intern hanging around to watch me really didn't help with the nerves either. What is really important, however, though, is that when you make a mistake, you don't hide it. Mistakes need to be reported. It's part of the clinical process to help identify systemic errors or the potential for errors and to work out if there is any education or training needs or if there needs to be a change in policy and procedure in order to reduce the risk of these errors. Most health systems will also have an open disclosure policy where any mistakes are discussed frankly and openly with patients and their next of kin. Probably the biggest mistake that I've been involved in is being part of a chain that resulted in a patient being given a different patient's medication. And even though I personally wasn't the one who gave the incorrect medication to the patient, there were mistakes that I had made as well as part of that process. I'm not going to lie, that phone call to the patient's next of kin to tell them that we'd made an error and given their loved ones the wrong medication was one of the most nerve-wracking things I've had to do as a nurse. Your employer will most likely provide you with education on their open disclosure policy, but remember, a key part is just giving a simple apology. And remember, an apology is not a legal admission of guilt, but what most people want when an error has been made is an acknowledgement of their experience and an apology that occurred. So, how do you recover from making a mistake? Firstly, it's important that you recognize you've made a mistake and address it. This doesn't make you an unsafe practitioner. Realizing that you've made a mistake does not mean that you are a terrible nurse. Unsafe practitioners are ones who do not realize or recognize that they are making mistakes. As I've previously covered, apologizing and open disclosure is a really important step in processing a mistake. Accept that there may be consequences to that mistake. You may need to monitor your patient more closely. They may need treatment to deal with that mistake. If you've made a serious error, you may need additional training or support. Your manager may talk to you about an error. For example, I once missed a patient's dose of Clexane before they were transported to another hospital, and my manager and I had a brief chat about making sure to check the med chart when giving handover. But it's important to remember when reporting mistakes and errors, it's not about seeking out individuals to punish. Unless you're wantonly and recklessly ignoring policy, you're not going to be punished. But it's about being aware of your scope and reporting that so that there is that examination to see if there is something that could be changed. Learn from your mistakes. Think about what went wrong and why, and what you can do in future. But the final, and I would say in some ways the most important thing, is you need to learn to let it go. Carry the learning from that mistake. So don't just forget that ever happened. Think about what you've learned and apply that learning, but do not carry the guilt, the anxiety of that mistake with you. Don't let it all build up and get overwhelming. And if you're finding that something's happened and you can't let it go, speak to someone. Don't become overwhelmed by that. Now, that being said, whilst mistakes absolutely will happen, obviously our goal is not to make mistakes. So, what are some ways that we can prevent or reduce the risk of making mistakes? So, always ask questions about things. Make sure you check your policies. When I first started, I made an error with frequency of observations for iron infusions. I'd read the policy, but I was in a rush and I misinterpreted it. Now, I'm really familiar now with the iron infusion policy and the policy around observations at my first hospital, but I've recently started working at a second hospital and I had to give an iron infusion. I thought, better check their policy, and guess what? It's completely different in terms of the rates and the volumes given. So had I not checked the policy, I would have made an error. Even though I knew how to give that infusion safely at my first hospital, in order to comply with that policy and procedure at the second hospital, I had to be familiar with that policy and procedure. So make sure you check your policies and slow down. If you're not familiar with something, slow down. If you're very, very familiar with something, still slow down. Make sure you are paying attention and that you're not just doing anything on muscle memory. So for example, I once prepped an IV infusion, got it checked by a clinical nurse, hung it, was just about to start it, when I suddenly realized that what I and the nurse checking had both missed was the fact that it was actually an oral medication, not an IV one. So slow down, check things carefully, listen to your gut. In another example, I had a patient who was charted for 120 units of insulin. I checked with the doctor, who told me go check with the patient. I asked the patient if they took 120 units of insulin, and they said yes. I checked again with the doctor, who said if that's what the patient said, it must be correct, but it still just didn't feel like an appropriate volume of insulin to be giving. So I took the insulin pen to the patient and said, look, to give you 120 units, I have to give you 2 injections. And the patient's like, well, I don't take 2 injections. I was like, so show me on the pen how much insulin you give yourself at home. The patient proceeded to dial up just 20 units of insulin. So in this scenario, we got it recharted and the patient received the right dose. But if we had just gone with the fact that, look, the doctor said it's fine, the patient said it's fine, let's just give that, that patient probably would have, well, there's a very high chance they could have died from an insulin overdose. So listen to your gut, seek clarification more than once if you need to, if something doesn't feel right. The other thing is develop your emotional awareness, your knowledge of how you're feeling in the moment. Those nurses you see who always seem to be calm and in control are not just magically that way. I know for myself, when I'm having a busy shift, I often find myself winding up, getting tense, short-tempered and anxious. And when I find myself feeling like that, I need to stop. I literally stop, take a deep breath, let it out and emotionally reset. It's a really simple step, but it's so important in staying on top of my emotions and not making silly or rash mistakes. Learn not only from your mistakes, but from the mistakes of others. Whether this be informal sharing or from updates received from the hospital. So at my hospital, we recently got an email just reminding us that the liquid Schedule 8 morphine, you need to take out the dose that you need from that. It doesn't just come in the dose in the pod. You need to actually measure out how much you need, or else you could be overdosing your patient. Another thing that can be quite interesting to read, or I personally find quite interesting to read, is called From Death We Learn. And From Death We Learn is a report published yearly by the coroner, focusing on deaths where there are lessons to be learnt by public service, many of which are around communication and delivery of healthcare. And obviously this is looking at very serious clinical incidences because they've gone to the coroner. And I'll include a link for these below. I think it's been published yearly since about 2006, but it's a really interesting read, and a lot of it is about things like communication, simple mistakes that we can make that can have a profound impact on patients. And so just kind of the final thing I want to address here is, what are you going to do at the end of your shift? Once you walk off that ward, seriously, let it go. Nursing is a 24-hour job, and you need to learn how to let it go at the end of that shift. Don't carry that shift, that patient with you all the time, or else it is going to mentally wear you down. I do, however, recommend you taking time to reflect if you found it a really busy or overwhelming shift. But when you reflect, and that can either just be mentally, it can be verbally, it can be writing it down. But when you reflect, take time to think about what you did well, what you've actually achieved in that shift. It's often so easy to think of all the things we did wrong, but make sure that you also acknowledge and recognize the things that you've done well, what you've actually achieved, how you've grown. And as part of this, I would say, make sure you have some kind of self-care routine. So this might be engaging in mindfulness, and I used a mindfulness app for the first 6 to 8 weeks of my grad program. Engaging in exercise, even if it's just going for a walk after work. It might be engaging in a creative hobby. I bake a lot when I get stressed at work. You might find journaling a useful way to decompress. You might have shifts where you feel the need to debrief, and that can either be formally or informally. I regularly offload to my mother, just make sure that you are preserving patient privacy. I also use sleep stories after late shifts to get to sleep, or else I would take hours to settle down, which is not ideal if you have an early shift the next morning. And even though I don't specifically use those anymore, I will still quite often listen to an audiobook after a late shift to help me get to sleep. There isn't a right or wrong, but do find a way to decompress, to let go, and to make sure that there is something in your life other than nursing. At the end of the day, you will care for your patients so much better if you are also caring for yourself.